In this part of the tutorial, we're going to show you how to access elements in number arrays specifically in Android. So we're going to do that first by creating some arrays and then accessing elements within them at various positions. So we'll create an integer, float, and double array, and we're going to access the first, last, second, and then third elements, and we're going to print them out on our app screen. By this point, we now know how to create and initialize arrays of different variable types. So we start off with booleans, then moved to integers, floats and doubles, then we went to characters and then strings. So we know how to create these arrays of different types, we know how to populate them with values, but we don't really know how to do anything past that. It's all well and good to create these arrays, but if you can't access the elements, you can't do anything with the arrays, then what's the point? So I'm going to show you how to do that in just a minute after we get set up here. So right now we're going to deal with the numbers variables. So these are int, floats, and doubles. We'll do booleans, strings, and characters later on. So what we'll want to do is we'll want to create some arrays. We'll want an array of integers, an array of floats, and an array of doubles. And we can assign pretty much any arbitrary values. So let's use the examples that we came up with throughout the tutorials. For example, our int array. Remember, to make it an array, we put the square brackets there. Was a list of commands. So let's just call this, in fact, list of, you know what, let's be more specific. These are movement commands. So let's say we have a character in a game, or we're programming a robot or something, and we want it to move forwards or backwards. So every element in this array will be some kind of a movement. So positive movement, positive elements will be moving the robot or the character forwards, whereas negative will be moving them back. So remember how we could declare arrays like this. We could say new int, and then say, for example, 5 elements, or we could just go ahead and put the elements right in these curly braces. Well, I'm going to go ahead and put them right in the curly braces. I'm not going to bother calling the new operator because it's not necessary and it saves a little bit of time and effort. If you were to create 100 arrays, then you would definitely want to try and save time. So let's give this array some movement commands. Let's have our character move forwards 4, backwards 3, backwards 2, forwards 10, forwards 5, and then backwards 5 again. So now we've created our array of integers, which we've called movement commands, and we've populated it. Let's create a float and a double array. So we have an array of floats, and we're going to call this perhaps meal costs. Maybe we want to keep track of our spending on meals, so we're creating an array of meal costs for the week. Perhaps we've been eating out too much and we want to try and save a bit of money. And remember, each element, because they're floats, has to be succeeded by the f here. So then we have 15 perhaps 0.47, then we can have an expensive meal, it's 20.48, and then a pretty cheap meal, let's have this 9.85. And put in the F after each one. Cool. So now we have an array of meal costs, and there were 4 meals, and they're all floats. Now, let's move on to our final type, and that's going to be a double. So we'll have the square brackets, it's an array, and this is going to be bank transactions. Okay, so again we have a bank account, and we have deposits, which will be positive elements, and withdrawals, which will be negative elements, depending on what kind of spending we're doing or saving throughout this period. So we'll have the first one be maybe a deposit of 1,000, then we can have a withdrawal of perhaps 350, then maybe another deposit of 220, and then perhaps we can have another withdrawal of 50.67. So now we've initialized 3 different arrays. We have an int array, we have a float array, and we have a double array. This is all very good. It's nice that we've created these things, but now we want to do something with them. And the first step to being able to do anything with these arrays is to be able to access the individual elements. Now, first things first, before I show you how to access the elements, I should talk about indexing. So, in an array, we have each element at a specific position, or what we call an index. So for example, this is element 1, this is element 2, element 3, 4, 5, and 6. Same with these, element 1, 2, 3, 4, and 1, 2, 3, 4. However, in C# and in many other languages, array indices start at 0. So this is element 1, but it's at index 0. This will be at index 1, index 2, 3, 4, and 5. So although this is 6 elements long, we start at index 0 and end at index 5. So if I wanted to access the first element, it would be index 0, last element index 5. Let me show you how to access elements now. So what we want to do is we want to call the name of the array. Let's start off with the integer array. This is movement commands. And let's say we want to access the very first element. We want to access element 0. Now this is good that we're accessing it, but we need to store this into a variable. So we'll create an int, and this is going to be called first element. And we're going to assign it to be movement commands 0. So in this line, we are accessing the array movement commands. Specifically, we're accessing element 0. So this is the element at position 0, which will be element 1. And in this case, it's a 4. And we're storing that 4 in our new integer called first element. So integer first element now contains the element at index 0 of the array movement commands, which will be 4. And just to verify that, we can print it out in our app. So let's have this be first element, and we'll have it converted to a string. Alright, so let's go ahead and run this. We'll use the NexusS again. And while it's building, now we get these warnings because our float and double arrays are not being used, which is fine. We'll use them later on, so just ignore these for now. And our app prints out 4. And this is because our first element is our variable called first element is accessing the very first element of movement commands, which is at index 0, which is number 4. Similarly, if we were to access the very last element, which will be at index 5, remember 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we were to stop this and run it again, so same warnings, remember you can just ignore those, we get negative 5, and that's because that's the last element. Now, let's create a float so we can access the meal costs array. So let's call this one second element. Can you guess which one we're going to access? That's right, we're going to access the second element. So this is going to be, remember, index 0, index 1, index 2, index 3, even though this is the first element, second element, third element, fourth element. I know it's a little counterintuitive. Perhaps it would be easier if all arrays just started at index 1, but that's just not how things are. So we're going to access 1 position, or rather index 1, so it's going to be the second element. And instead of printing out first element, let's print out second. Okay. And we're going to stop this and rerun it. And as soon as, again, we're getting some errors. This is not used and that's not used, which is fine. and we get 15.47 being printed out. So perhaps we want to know where the second meal, or how much the second meal cost. There we go, we can just go into the array and access the second element there, which is 1547. And just to hammer the point home, we're going to create a double. We'll call this third element, and we'll access the third element of bank transactions. So this will be number 2. Remember, because 0, 1, and 2. And now we're going to print out third instead of second element. So stop and rerun it, same as before. And now these two aren't being used, that's fine, not to worry. And we get 202 being printed out. Now although we specified this to be 200.20, the 0 is a little redundant, which is why the double omits it when it goes to print out. Although it's accurate to that many decimal places, unless needed, it won't print out that many. So this is pretty much all there is to accessing elements within an array. This is a single element array, which means that we only have one line rather than a grid. We'll talk about multiple element arrays later, but for now this is basically how you would access it. So just points to remember, starts at index 0 and ends at the index that's 1 less than the size. So although this is index 0, index 5, this is element 1 and element 6. So you call the name of the array list, and then you call the index of the element you want to access, and then you generally have to store this inside a variable. Right, and that's pretty much all there is to accessing elements within an array. In this part of our tutorial, I showed you how to access elements in number arrays in Android. So these were arrays of either ints, floats, or doubles. We created one of each, and then accessed various elements within those arrays and had them print out on our app screen. So by now, you should be able to access any element of a given number array and print it out on the screen. Just some things to remember. You access the element by calling the array name and then the index of the element you want. And also indexes start at 0 and end at 1 less than the size of the array, whereas array elements themselves start at 1 and end at the size of the array.